All right, you may have read student loans are restarting in September, and we have a big court case in front of the Supreme Court about student loans and their cancellation. So what is going on with student loans? Goldie and I are going to talk about that. I want to do a couple of fact-finding things at the top so we can talk about what's going on. First and foremost, student loans were paused because of the pandemic. There were a lot of things that were going on in the pandemic, of course. The economy had collapsed. We had to shut off the world economy. There were a lot of sensible things that were done. At the top of that sensible list was if you were in the middle of a pandemic and you were in dire loss of your job, you didn't have to pay back your student loans during that period. That was an incredibly sensible thing. Millions of Americans have student loans. Somewhere around 43 million plus Americans have student loans. They were held harmless for their student loans. After that, President Biden came in and said, you know what? I have the authority to cancel a bunch of these student loans, and so I'm going to cancel them. So he went in and he canceled, I think it was up to about $20,000 of your student loans. He canceled those, and that his attempt to cancel those is being taken up to the Supreme Court. Right now, the authority for that had held student loans without payment is ending, and that happens to end on September 1st. So they were paused for almost 3 years, and they were not permanently canceled. So now it's coming back on. That's what's happening. That's where we are. So about 43 million people are going to start paying back their loans. You're probably seeing this float around about people talking about what it's going to mean for their pocketbook. So student loans, how do they impact the economy? Goldie.
Well, obviously, you have to start with the personal impact on the borrowers. And it is an incredible burden on a huge swath of those 43 million borrowers. Obviously, not all of them. Some of them have incomes in which they can handle it, but it disproportionately, in terms of burden, it affects people of color. It disproportionately affects people at the lower end of the income scale. When you're paying back those loans, that's going to take spending out of local economies. It also distorts the labor market in many unfortunate ways. People end up in jobs that they're not. It's not the job that they'd prefer. It's not the job that they're necessarily trained for, but it's the job that pays enough for them to pay back their student loan. So you'll have people who trained as social workers or teachers, something that we need many, many more of, that we have these shortages, and yet, they're working in some office at Amazon or some other company doing something that pays better so they can afford their loans instead of pursuing the professions that they trained for. That is incredibly inefficient. It also locks people into jobs when it would be more efficient for them to choose something else, to maybe switch to a better job that might be the same industry, but better suits their needs, because they can't afford to, when they're paying these loans, they can't afford that break in their income. So it's, massive effects throughout the economy, from your local stores all the way up to just making the whole thing less efficient.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about how we got into this goddamn mess. Not surprisingly, this was an idea hatched in the neoliberal fantasy land where we needed to move public education. To be clear, most of this at one point was a public good in universities. Public universities all over this country used to provide very low cost education, higher education, both through community college programs, technical colleges, but most importantly, state universities. Those were either no cost in some places at one point to very low cost. And that low cost lasted all the way through the 90s, which is really incredible. This is recent history, to be clear, that we moved to a different model. And that model was effectively a trickle-down neoliberal model in which we want to subject this public good to market forces. Not surprisingly, a lot of the advocacy of this was driven by your normal supporters of neoliberal economics, including corporations, service providers, banks, and Republicans and Democrats. And then there was this whole compromise that was bandied about at the turn of the century, the 21st century, that is. So in the early 2000s, hey, we're going to charge you more in tuition, but guess what? We're also going to dramatically increase our public support for tuition supports. In other words, in scholarships. And if you're low income, don't worry, we'll take good care of you. Financial aid.
Yeah, it's the high tuition, high financial aid model. And it half worked.
It half worked.
We got the high tuition.
Exactly. Yeah. So it just turns out they didn't come through with the second half of the agreement, which is they were going to do high financial aid. And what ended up happening is you had much higher tuition. It was less subsidized by the public. And then people had to go out and effectively subsidize it themselves by taking out loans. So this system was designed. This is not the weather. This didn't happen by happen chance. We used to have a highly subsidized system, nearly fully subsidized, including in California, by the way. As Goldie was pointing out, Reagan unwound that, but in California, it was basically free to go to public education. And the only reasonable thing, if you want to get an education, which is a thing that people should want to pursue, both because it's a advancement of you as a human, right? You're not your human capital, how it's going to be used by capital out in the world, but you as a human in the old sense of the humanities, and also can give you a lot of access to opportunity in the future. The only way to get that then for so many people is to turn to loans. And that's how we got into this mess. They needed to figure out how to close that gap. They turned to loans, and there are a lot of rapacious loan providers out there that stepped into this. And let's be honest, they are often manipulating 17 and 18-year-old kids into taking massive loans, and or their parents who may not themselves have much financial education or experience. This may be the first time that they are taking out this sizable kind of loan or underwriting or helping their kid navigate this. And so a lot of unwitting people in a period of time when we were jacking up tuition rates, the only way they could get access to education was through this loan system, which is how we got into this terrible mess we're in.
Right. And the universities, let's be clear, both public, private, for-profit, not-for-profit, they played a big role in this because they're the ones pushing the loans to the students. Since the mid-aughts, most of these loans, about 93% of them, have come from the federal government. So they are federal. It used to be that they were federally guaranteed loans, but they were private. Now they are federal loans, which are privately administered. So it feels the same. You have banks and other loan processors who are actually handling your loans, and you're sending your payments to them. It feels the same way, but the debt is actually to the federal government. The bulk of this $1.6 trillion in debt is debt owed the federal government. And that is why the federal government has the power to cancel this debt. So it's not in private hands. He has the power, according to the best legal scholars on this question, except for maybe our Supreme Court. You notice I didn't say the best legal scholars. But you know what the Supreme Court. What the main argument before the court is? This is stunning. The court is pity the poor loan processors. That if it is a case, I think, out of Missouri. I think it's Missouri, a Missouri loan processor who owes the state like $120 million from some loan they got from the state. And the argument is that they won't be able to pay back that loan if these student loans are forgiven. This percentage of loans are forgiven because their profits will be down. Now, there's no evidence that their profits will be down. They're still making profits, but the argument is it breaks a contract with the loan processors. So we can't forgive any of this debt because that would be unfair to the loan processing companies. All right, let's unpack this really quick. There are loans that have been in forbearance. You've been held harmless for repayment for a very long time now under COVID. Biden and team wanted to keep that. Unfortunately, Congress didn't agree to it. Now that we're coming out of COVID's emergency, people are going to have to start repaying their loans. There's a second thing, which is that Biden, through his authority,
canceled up to $20,000 of loans for a huge portion of people.
Right.
About 40 million people.
$10 to $20,000.
Yep.
Right.
Sort of depended on a formula. And then that got stalled because of this case that Goldie was just talking about, which is going in front of the Supreme Court. So for those who are about to have to start repaying things, let's talk about the impact. First and foremost, you, for now almost going on 3 years, you were able to take whatever you used to be sending to these loan processors, which went back to the federal government. Maybe it's $400, maybe it's $250, although it could be all the way up to $700 or $1,000, depending on your loans. Now that is money that you had been spending in your community, using to save for things, other things that you could do with that, and you're going to have to start repaying your loans. That is actually a massive suck out of the general economy. It's one of these things where you have become a great consumer in your community, maybe you were able to save and start a business or do other things that were really great for your community and the economy. This, in my view, I don't know how you feel, Goldie, but it's really kind of a waste of good resources to send this off to go back to the federal government to pay for this thing.
Yeah, well,
that is not what those trickle-downers are telling these people.
There's nothing inflationary about loan forgiveness because that money was already spent. The college has already spent it. The money's been spent, right? But when you pay that back to the government, the government has its budget already. It's not like it's going to spend more or less depending on how much money it comes back. That money literally disappears from the economy. So it's not going anywhere. It's going out of circulation. Now, if you're worried about inflation, maybe you think that's a good thing. I personally am not worried about inflation. It's been coming down quite dramatically. I think that the impact on individuals and their communities is much more my concern. But understand, that money's not going to some better use. It is disappearing. It won't be spent. Money that would have been spent will now not be spent.
Yeah, totally. And what we do know is that you today are spending it. That's the good news. We actually want that to happen. We want you spending that money. We want you making good decisions. We want you to deploy that in your community. And most importantly, we want you to be able to use it to further yourself. This is one of the things that's tragic about this whole student loan debacle is that at a time in your life when you should be able to use your resources to better yourself, maybe start a business, or maybe if you have a financial emergency, you could use that so that rather than going into further debt, you could attack a emergency you might have. There are a lot of good uses for those dollars. Sending it back to the federal government to disappear inside of this budget is not the best use of these dollars. I wanted to ask, here's the thing, Goldie. I hear a lot of trickle-downers talk about the kind of moral hazard of this whole thing. I also hear them rarely talk about the moral hazards of everything that happens with the Trump tax cuts and the other types of incentives that we have for wealthy people to not pay back things. I'm just curious what your sense of all of this moral hazard is. Yeah,
well, there's a moral hazard to using the moral hazard argument, obviously. Yeah, it's always a bullshit argument. Like this, after the Great Recession, when we bailed out all the banks, because otherwise the economy would have collapsed. So we bailed out the mortgage lenders, the lenders who had given out all of these bullshit loans on properties that couldn't support it, the predatory lenders. We had to bail them out. Forget about moral hazard there. But you know who we didn't bail out? The borrowers. We allowed the borrowers to lose their houses while we made the lenders whole. So moral hazard is an argument that is used by economists to basically keep lower income people in thrall. Nobody really cares about moral hazard. What is the moral hazard of forgiving student loan debt? That maybe people might go out and get more education than they need? Is that what they're arguing? That you don't want an overly educated populace? That would be bad. In the end, this idea that there's a moral hazard to getting a good education, that's just silly. That's unbelievable. And as you pointed out, the moral hazard gets trotted out all the time to shame the working and the poor, but somehow is never applied to the rich and the powerful. It's absurd. It is not, do not buy it. If you hear it out there, if you hear the shame factors coming from left, right, and center trickle-downers, by the way, will tell you that this is somehow some crazy moral hazard is being created by forgiving loans that people are
dying under, they're weighted under, they can't do anything.
Right.
They're really held back from fully participating in the economy by these terrible decisions that were made by policymakers, right? Policymakers made decisions that you at 17 years old had nothing to do with. You were just trying to further yourself, get this education so you can have a better life.
Not
and
just
the
that.
only way to access it was through these loans.
You are a 17, 18-year-old following the American dream, following the consensus advice that you should pursue a college education because
Right.
that's how you better yourself and make yourself a stable member and a contributing member of the American middle class. You did the responsible thing. What everybody told you was the responsible thing was to go to college. And because your parents weren't rich, you had to take out loans to do that, which, by the way, these colleges told you to do. That's what they advised you to do. Everybody told you to do this as a 17, 18-year-old. You listened to your elders and you did it. And now there's a moral hazard in paying off that loan that teenager version of you took out.
Yeah,
that's crazy.
It's incredible. It's incredible. All right, so we're going to watch how this all unfolds. I hope you learned something about how this came about, where we were, where we are, where we're going. You can clearly tell that we find this entire neoliberal world order critique of education is really false. It's actually led us to this terribly dangerous place. And I think we're in a spot now. We'll see what the Supreme Court does. If they are actually following the law, as anybody would reasonably interpret it, that this case shouldn't even be heard, as Goldie pointed out. They've had to come up with a convoluted way to get this in front of the court. It's very clear that the president has the power to eliminate this amount of your debt. Should do it. It's the right thing to do. And then secondly, it's a shame on Congress that they didn't pass the law that would have continued this forbearance longer. That really is a shame. We're about to see a lot of money taken out of the economy. It's about to go from your hand, if you have a student loan in forbearance, and into this into a processor, and then back into the federal government's coffers, where it largely, just as Goldie points out, disappears.
Yeah, and let's be clear. The reason why it's happening in September is because Republicans insisted on it. This was their big get out of the debt ceiling hostage taking. This was the big thing they got. The biggest thing they got was starting up payment on student loans. Otherwise, they would have, it's either that or we're going to send the country into default and tank the global economy by having us default on our debt. So that's what they got out of it. That's their big win.
Yeah.
That's
just to give
why
you a
it's
sense,
happening now. It's not happening for any other reason than politics.
That's right. It's pure politics.